Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello, insiders. Justin Rivers, Chief Experience Officer for Untapped New York, with you again today. It is our pleasure to welcome Mary Habstritt, who is Museum Director and President of the Lilac Preservation Project. And she will be guiding us today virtually through the Lilac. But first, thank you, Pete from San Francisco, Carrie from Aurora, Colorado, Mark from Boston. Welcome, 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 everybody. We have our good group of regulars today. If there's anybody new joining us for the first time, let us know. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to everybody new. Oh, hi, Jeffrey. How are you? Good to see you here from the Upper West Side. A lot of you guys I've spoken to in some capacity, so if I recognize it, it's almost like we're sitting around here. Joel. Hi from Reston, Virginia. Cool. Thank you for joining us from Virginia. All right, so this, and I know Mary's going to go into this during her presentation. This was originally an insider in-person tour of the Lilac. I am well, Jeffrey, thank you. It hopefully will be again after the pandemic, but in the time being, Mary was gracious enough to convert it into a virtual talk for us and for all of you who may not be in the New York area. But as Michelle said, even when we go back to doing in-person insider experiences, we are going to live stream them. So if you are from other parts of the country, you will be able to join us anyway. All right, with that all being said, for those of you who are new, what we do is if you have questions for Mary during the presentation, please type them in the chat. I will be monitoring the questions. And then when Mary is done, we will be doing Q&A with her and I will be moderating that. Without further ado, Mary, please take it away.
Thanks, Justin. And as you said, this was supposed to be an in-person tour on a weekday evening after work. It was going to be co-led by our operations director, Luke Gayford. He is an essential worker for the Department of Sanitation, however, so once we converted this to a midday virtual talk, you were left with just me. And of course, we're doing the tour with photos. History, why our ship is significant, and then talking about what we're doing to revitalize her. There we go. The U.S. Lighthouse tender Lilac was built for the U.S. Lighthouse Service and launched on May 26, 1933. She's the oldest and the most intact lighthouse tender of only 3 that survive from the Lighthouse Service. All lighthouse tenders were named for flowers, shrubs, and trees, a tradition that began just after the Civil War. The other 2 tenders that survive are the fir, as in the evergreen tree, near San Diego, and the maple in Milwaukee. The Lighthouse Service was a civilian federal agency dedicated specifically to maintaining aids to navigation. And in spite of the name, that was not just lighthouses, but lightships, buoys, range lights, and other markers that help ships move around safely. The launch of Lilac was an important event attended by George Putnam, Commissioner of Lighthouses, and John Dickinson, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce. Putnam led the Lighthouse Service from 1910 to 1935, a period of significant expansion and modernization. Upon his retirement, he said, "I am proud to have been able to help in making less hazardous the voyages of those who go down to the sea in ships." His daughter, Christy Putnam, who's the one holding the flowers here, was Lilac's sponsor and christened the ship. And sponsors are traditionally women, and their job goes beyond just christening the ship. They actually maintain a relationship with the ship itself and with the original crew. Lilac was assigned to the 4th Lighthouse District, which covered the Delaware River from Trenton, New Jersey, south to the mouth of the Delaware Bay. She was originally based in Edgemoor, Delaware, just outside of Wilmington. After World War II, she was based in Gloucester City, New Jersey, across the river from South Philadelphia. The U.S. Lighthouse Service was disbanded, and its duties of tending aids to navigation, and the vessels that did that job were transferred to the Coast Guard in 1939, and Lilac became a U.S. Coast Guard cutter. Larger Coast Guard vessels are known as cutters to honor the Coast Guard's roots in the Revenue Cutter Service. This service traces its beginnings back to 1790, when Alexander Hamilton, who we all know well now from the musical, applied for funding for a fleet of fast boats to intercept foreign ships and make sure that custom duties were paid when entering American ports. This provided a source of revenue for our young country. And as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton was also the first superintendent of lighthouses when the system of beacons was federalized. Many of our first lighthouses were built by the colonies. Keeping ships safe was vital to maritime commerce. During World War II, protecting the coast was added to Lilac's duties. Lilac was painted gray. She was equipped with sonar to detect submarines and armed with depth charges. A 3-inch 50 deck gun was mounted on her bow, and 20mm anti-aircraft guns were added to the roof deck. To protect the ship itself, a degaussing system was added that changed the magnetic signature of the hull so that mines could not detect the ship passing by. The Philadelphia area, which Lilac patrolled, built 35% of ships for the war effort, and 18 ships were known to have been sunk by U-boats in the vicinity of Delaware Bay. It was an area critical to fighting the war, and aids to navigation had to continue to be maintained to guide new ships out to sea. During Lilac's years of service, most lighthouses had keepers who lived on site, often with their families, to ensure the light was always on and to activate the foghorn in bad weather. Tenders like Lilac brought supplies to keepers, helped with major repairs, moved keepers and their families in and out, and brought inspectors around to make sure that everything was shipshape. Tenders brought everything that was needed for these keepers to live and work in remote lighthouses that were only reachable by boat. Here you can see Lilac crew filling tanks on the dock at Ship John Shoal Light. Although lighthouses typically had cisterns to catch rainwater, many are surrounded by salt water, too far from land to be connected to drinking water systems, so the tender brought fresh water for drinking and bathing. Fuel was burned in generators to provide the electricity for the light. Now all lighthouses are automated, and a buoy tender visits them only about once a year. Lightships were used in places where lighthouses could not be built, such as at shifting barrier islands, shoals, or sandbars, especially when these are far from land. These ships had to remain anchored in place to mark the dangerous spot or to guide ships to harbor. So like lighthouses, their supplies were brought to them by lighthouse tenders. Lightships are no longer used, but a number of them do survive. This one in Lewis, Delaware is painted with the name Overfalls, the lightship that was tended by Lilac. You may be familiar with the ones in Manhattan, the Frying Pan near 26th Street on the Hudson River, and the Ambrose at South Street Seaport. Those are both lightships as well. But Lilac always spent most of her time tending buoys, in spite of the name lighthouse tender. And maintaining buoys has always been, and continues to be, one of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs in the Coast Guard, and requires a well-trained crew operating from ships and boats specially designed and built for this purpose. Among design features that support this work are the nearly vertical sides of the ship, which make handling buoys easier. She also was built to be extremely stable in order to lift enormous weight while afloat. The buoy in this photo is one of the largest buoys that Lilac handled. You can get a sense of the scale by looking at the deck crew and noticing that the ship is listing slightly. Her steam-powered boom was capable of lifting up to 40,000 pounds, or 20 tons. We've calculated that this buoy would have weighed about 18,000 pounds by itself. Its anchor chain and the concrete sinker that was used to anchor it would have added another nearly 20,000 pounds. So this buoy being set, actually not lifted at this point, would have weighed nearly as much as the ship could lift. Ships that tend aids to navigation must go out in all kinds of weather, especially since ice and bad weather can be the cause of a buoy breaking free from its mooring. If a buoy is not working or not in its proper place, a tender can't wait because other ships are in danger. Lilac broke ice when needed to get where she had to go and often traveled through heavy seas. Veteran crews say their busiest time was during the spring thaw when floes and cakes of ice carried buoys downriver. Buoy tenders going about their regular duties often were first upon the scene when a vessel was in distress, and they were equipped with firefighting and rescue equipment. Lilac responded to several disasters during her career, including a collision between two tankers in 1953. The Chester, Pennsylvania Times reported that, quote, "The surrounding waters were aflame with gasoline. In spite of the danger, Coast Guard vessels and small craft from riverfront points as far away from the explosion as Philadelphia, which was about 45 miles from where this happened, responded to the rescue call and began taking burned and oil-soaked seamen from the water. Lilac served as the command center for the search and rescue." Lilac was decommissioned in 1972 at a formal ceremony at Curtis Bay, where the Coast Guard has its own shipyard near Baltimore. Many Lighthouse tenders were retired that same year, probably because the recently passed Clean Water Act made pumping waste over the side illegal, and converting these old workboats to add holding tanks would have been difficult and prohibitively expensive. Lilac was donated to the Harry Lundeberg School of Seamanship, operated by the Seafarers International Union, where she served as a floating dormitory for cadets training to join the Merchant Marine. 12 years or so later, a marina owner in Virginia, that's Falling Creek, Virginia, I think someone was linking in from Virginia. That marina operator bought Lilac, planning to resell the ship, but ended up instead renting the back out as a real estate office and selling parts off the bridge and from the engine room. After his death in 2002, Lilac was purchased from his widow by a group of historic ship enthusiasts in New York City who wanted to restore a steamship for the public. In March 2003, Lilac was purchased for just $25,000, contingent on passing an inspection of her hull. Never buy a boat if you don't get to look at the bottom. Lilac went to Lyons Shipyard in Virginia for dry docking. Jerry Weinstein, who underwrote the project, and Marine surveyor Charlie DeRocco look pretty happy here with what they've seen so far, and our restoration work began. An additional $250,000 was spent at the shipyard to clean and paint Lilac's hull and upper parts. This is the before, once it was cleaned and paint stripped off, and this is after. The propellers were removed for the long tow from Virginia to New York in order to reduce drag. They currently sit on Lilac's buoy deck, and we're making plans to repair and reinstall them. Visitors often ask me if they're spares. These are very large, expensive parts. We don't keep spares. They also often ask about those big chips taken out of the port side propeller blades and what happened. We don't know yet what she hit, but obviously it was hard and took some pretty big chunks out of the propeller blades. Once work was done at the shipyard, Lilac would set off for New York City. After a brief stay at Brooklyn's Red Hook Container Port while a berth was prepared, Lilac moved to Pier 40 in Hudson River Park at the end of 2003. She stayed there until moving to Pier 25 in 2011. And one of the really unique things about Lilac and why many of our founding board members were interested in saving her was that she still had her original 2 steam engines. They were preserved by having 2 owners previous to us who were not interested in operating her. If they had been, they would undoubtedly have torn the steam engines out and replaced them with more fuel-efficient diesel engines that also need fewer crew to operate them. This is the portside triple expansion engine around the time that LILAC was decommissioned, when the engines were still in pristine shape. And this is what the engine room looked like not long after I began work at LILAC in 2009. I borrowed some steam engineers from a historic steam railway to check the portside engine for the first time. They lifted the cylinder heads and looked inside and found the cylinders to actually be in very good shape. Since we are dependent on skilled volunteers though, things go in fits and starts. And it wasn't until May of 2016 that we finally cranked this engine over for the first time, thanks to engineer John Zepp. Once he was able to focus on it, it actually only took 3 months of work to get to the point of cranking it over. The starboard engine took longer, having suffered more corrosion from a leaky skylight, but that one was also finally cranked over last year. We're not yet able to get steam up, but the engines are in near operating condition. This is a recent photo that shows our progress. Work continues in the engine room and other parts of the ship, but especially here we're still connecting things up, repairing mechanisms, including the cranks that open the skylight. They turned out to be more complicated than you would think, but that was mainly due to the scarcity of people who can cast and machine custom parts in New York City. We had new brass handles cast in Indiana for the cranks, and then found some off-the-shelf nuts that could be modified by a machinist on Staten Island instead of being made from scratch. And then our volunteer crew put it all back together. That's Luke, our metalworking wizard on the left, our operations director who would have been co-leading the tour if we'd done this in person. And Risa is one of our high school volunteers. In 2013, we installed a new boiler for heat and replaced missing radiators in a project that included demolishing ducting and electric heat pumps installed in the 1970s for the SIU cadets. The heat pumps no longer worked and we could not get parts for them. Since we were planning to operate, well, we are planning to operate LILAC on steam again one day, it seemed appropriate to restore the steam heat. And I wanted to show you a little bit about what guides us in how we do our restoration. One thing is to use historic photos like this of the wardroom. It was one of the spaces where the radiators were long gone. The wardroom is the officer's lounge on a Coast Guard or Navy ship. And it's the place where the administrative officers can eat together and hold meetings and where they're served by a steward. It's off limits to the lower ranks, and many of our veteran seamen have never been in this room when they served on board. And this is a photo with the radiators back in place, the new radiators, and we've composed it similar to that historic shot so that you can see the difference. I think we did a pretty good job. Our current work includes addressing issues with the steel structure. Some damage was caused by modifications made through the years. For instance, in the crew head shown here, remodeling and adding fiberglass insulation around World War II actually encouraged damage, and they actually cut out some steel structure to add space. Some of the things that were problematic was when they put fiberglass insulation in, they had used poor quality steel to support it, which corroded and then corroded the older steel that it was attached to. So we have demolished the concrete and tile floor in here, removed the fiberglass insulation. So the steel is all revealed. We can assess the condition. And then we had to put back the missing longitudinal stringer. That's the beam you see being fitted there and bent to fit the knee, which is the corner support. So this is LILAC getting a new knee. For her 87th birthday this year on May 26th, LILAC received new rivets to hold that knee in place. We normally open the ship to the public on Memorial Day weekend each summer and celebrate the anniversary of the ship's launch by serving birthday cake to all visitors. So we had to do something different this year because of the pandemic. I did bake a cake for the crew, but I also got to cook some rivets. Lilac's purchase had included everything on board, so the hold had to be cleared of things like moldy school chairs. However, as you'll soon see, many items we wanted to be on the ship were missing. This photo shows the gyro repeater by itself on the bridge. It should be surrounded by a binnacle compass, the wheel stand, and telegraphs to communicate with the engine room, but all those had been sold off by the last owner. And that's what it looked like before he sold those things off, not too long before we purchased the ship. You can see the gyro repeater that was in the last photo. The only other piece of equipment that was on board when we got the ship in this area was the radar, which is the boxy piece of equipment with the round screen that you see. We have salvaged similar items off of other ships and put all those items back, but we've also benefited from things getting returned to us. Among other items, we got the original wheel back from Captain Homer Purdy. His daughter and grandson were driving it up to us from Tennessee a few years ago when their car lost its transmission near Dover, Delaware. They sent out an SOS, and one of Lilac's veterans, Petty Officer Tom Knotts, who's the one with the long hair in the picture, he's one of Lilac's veterans and served on board in the late 60s. He came to the rescue and drove the wheel the rest of the way. So this is the wheel arriving at Pier 25. We've reinstalled it on the bridge. It's probably our most popular attraction for visitors. We allow everyone to take a turn on it and pretend to be the helmsman. We do have to think about how visitors will interact with our artifacts so that they don't get damaged. In this case, although we reinstalled the wheel, we disconnected everything inside so that when the wheels turn, it doesn't move anything and the gears don't get damaged. More recently, we connected up the engine order telegraph that you can see in the background that's used to communicate with the engine room. And that also has become very popular. People love to see that demonstrated by our bridge docent. Although the ship was open for special events at Pier 40, she was not open on a regular basis to the public until we moved to Pier 25 in 2011. That pier was rebuilt specifically for historic ships, and the berth costs us $1 a year as long as we're offering public programs. And of course, we want people to get to know the ship and learn about her history and vital service. We do have to juggle our restoration work around the public schedule, but second only to keeping the ship afloat, the most important thing we do is tell visitors about the ship. Usually the ship is open weekend afternoons and for special events from May to October. We always have knowledgeable docents in the engine room and on the bridge to talk about the systems on board and how they serve the ship's purpose. Every summer, we host 2 or 3 different exhibits to give visitors a reason to return again. Some are site-specific art inspired by the ship. Some exhibits are photographs. Some are historical exhibits, but all have a maritime or water-related theme. Sometimes we stretch that a little bit, but we do try to keep it linked to the water. Exhibits on maritime history are generally borrowed from other sources due to the limits of our own staffing. In this case, we brought an exhibit from the Mel Fisher Maritime Museum in Key West. They have a maritime archaeology program and had found the wreck of a slave ship and built an exhibit around that traveled to Florida high schools. We were the only site outside of Florida that hosted the exhibit. We've also borrowed exhibits from the Coast Guard historian, one on the War of 1812 and the Coast Guard's role in that conflict. And we have borrowed an exhibit on shipwrecks from New York Sea Grant that focused on the shipwrecks in New York State's lakes. Most often we do art exhibits because there are not enough spaces for artists in the city to show their work. We have also used them to introduce the ship to people who might not come otherwise. People from the art world have visited the ship who would not have come to a historic vessel otherwise. And we allow the artists a fair amount of freedom in deciding where and how to hang the art, as long as they don't damage the ship. This lighted sculpture hanging in the engine room is one of several by George Kroner from an exhibit called Nocturnal Flora that was inspired by lilac's flowery name. We hold musical and dance performances, panel discussions, book signings, and lectures. In this case, we did a story hour for children, Captain Mary's Story Hour, and I read the book Fireboat by Myra Kalman. This is the first story hour we held on board. And afterwards, to celebrate it being the opening of this activity, we gave rides on the fireboat, John J. Harvey. There's usually a lot to see and do at Lilac, but it is closed for the 2020 season because of the pandemic. I do look forward to welcoming you on board sometime in the future.
Thank you, Mary.
And I hope you're getting lots of questions in the chat so we can talk some more.
Well, I have a ton of questions, but let's see. Does anybody from the audience have questions for Mary? You just inspired a new one. My first question is, so when, considering if all goes well with the pandemic, when is the earliest you think you can welcome people back on the boat?
Well, I'm kind of playing it by ear as far as setting up tours by appointment for individuals and small groups. We'll probably look at doing that once New York City is fully open. So won't be before mid-July. Our volunteering is continuing in a limited way with lots of protocols in place. We have about 4 or 5 people on board on Sundays to continue the restoration and maintenance work. But we're actually hoping to do some big projects while we're closed, when we don't have to work around the public schedule, and really make some major progress before next May and open up fully then.
Great. Peter has a good question, which actually dovetails into one of my questions. So Peter asked, do you have a target date for operating the steam engine? And maybe you could also talk a little bit about how steam engines operate, since it's been a while since steam has really been on the water.
Yeah, well, I hesitate to have a target date because when they bought the ship in 2003, they thought it would be operating within a couple of years, and here we are 17 years later. But one thing we have going for us now is added to our steam engineer, John Zepp, is our operations director, Luke Gayford, who grew up restoring ships in Australia. He used to skip school when he was 12 to learn how to rivet from the old guys. So he claims we'll get it running in 2 years. But like I said, I hesitate to set a date. We thought we'd be there by now. So steam engines, our engines are reciprocating engines, which means that they have pistons that go up and down in cylinders, as opposed to steam turbine engines, which were a later technology. The Titanic had both. That's something that often happens when a new technology is introduced. They'll put the new one on board and keep the old one just in case. The earliest steamboats had sails because they didn't feel they could count on the steam engines. And ours are triple expansion engines, which are really the pinnacle of reciprocating steam technology. They have 3 cylinders and pistons that get gradually bigger as the steam moves through, and that's to get as much work out of the steam as possible. They did have some quadruple engines with a 4th cylinder, but they took up so much additional real estate without adding a lot of efficiency that they didn't really catch on. So the triple expansion with the 3 cylinders are like the peak of steam technology on ships. And the small cylinder is the high pressure cylinder, and the steam comes in from the boiler room. Boiler rooms, even in like power plants, are separate from the engine rooms, because if you have a problem with an explosion or a fire, you can keep it isolated. So the boiler room is separate. Steam comes into the engines at the high pressure cylinder, which is the small one, and gets cycled through each cylinder, both pushing and pulling the piston. And then in our case, it was exhausted to a condensing tank. Steamships that ran in freshwater didn't always have condensers. The condenser allows the steam to cool and be recycled back to the boilers. And a ship like Lilac that worked in saltwater or brackish water needed to carry a freshwater supply for the engines, ran it through the condenser and recycled it, sent it back through again. I think that's basically it. I think with talking about the steam heat project, you might get the idea that the steam powered many things, and it did. The boom for lifting the buoys had its own steam engine. The propulsion engines in the engine room are accompanied by all kinds of auxiliary pumps that are steam powered, that moved fluids around the ship. To pump fuel off to a lighthouse, they needed to use steam pumps. The heat was steam. They used steam to melt ice off of the buoys, which they needed to do because they could get weighed down by the ice. And the bigger ones that guided ships to the harbor and had lights on, especially if they're sitting too low on the water because they're weighed down by ice, the ships might not see them in time to adjust course. So it's very important to get the ice off of the buoys, and they would use steam hoses to melt the ice off.
Cool. So what my question I had when watching the presentation, once you get the steam engines working, where will you go with Lilac? Will she travel? Will she go other places and be like a floating museum, or?
Well, we want to do educational excursions that give people the experience of being on a steamship, of course, but also learning about the Lighthouse service and the Coast Guard. We could, if a lighthouse still has a dock that's big enough, we could actually carry people to a lighthouse and visit the lighthouse. We have plenty of room on board. She once had a crew of 38, so people can sleep overnight if we get the ship certified by the Coast Guard for that. So there's several possibilities. I hope that you'll see her steaming around New York Harbor in not too long in the future.
That would be cool. That would be great. She looks, and honestly, in the pictures, for everybody who's watching, Mary and I were talking before when we were doing our test run. I've done some work with the SS Columbia project, which is a Kirby steamer being restored up in Buffalo with a goal to get back to Manhattan. And the SS Columbia has a long way to go with a lot of the work that they have to do, but the Lilac really looks beautiful. I mean, you've done some really beautiful work on her. She looks like she's in really good shape. So.
She was in really good shape when we got her, relatively speaking. And one thing we have going, since you bring up the Columbia, one thing we have going for us with the Lilac is that we have much more steel versus wood. The Columbia has a wooden superstructure. Mm-hmm. One thing is that makes it harder to get certified, as well as just being more of a maintenance headache. We do have wooden roofs on Lilac, though, even though she's otherwise steel, and a lot of wooden built-in furniture. So we're not completely without that issue, but it's all steel, very heavily built steel, because she did have to be out in all kinds of weather and do ice breaking. She's got an extremely thick hull at the bow, and it's all very good quality steel, riveted. I mean, I talked about the riveting project, but much of the ship is riveted structurally with some very early welding. Welding didn't really get used extensively in shipbuilding until World War II. But we do have some, according to Luke, who studied it. He's a professional welder. We have some really early experimental welding on board.
Some really good questions coming in now, Mary. How many
Okay.
people are required on board to operate the Lilac? That's from
I don't know in current inspected status what will be required to have. They did typically have at least 3 people in the engine room, which is what I usually get asked, is how many people were needed to run the engines. And one of the interesting things about that is I talked about the telegraphs and sending commands from the bridge to the engine room. There is no direct control over the engines from the bridge. You're at the mercy of the engine room crew, and the engine room crew can't see where the ship's going. So you have to have very close coordination between the bridge and the engine room. So I suspect nowadays we might need more people than they would have, because especially if it's run as an excursion vessel with passengers on board, that's not how it was operated before.
Right.
The Coast Guard will have to tell us to some degree how many we're required to have.
Great. So Shirley says, you're doing such a good job, Mary. Keep up the good work.
Thank
Edward
you.
paid a great compliment. Edward Atkins said, hopefully by 2021, there will be a vaccine for COVID-19 and all the people in the chat can visit the Lilac. And yes, Untapped Insiders, we will be going on the Lilac as soon as we can when we re-coordinate with Mary. The experience in being a volunteer with Open House New York and being on the Cutter Lilac was very rewarding. So that's a nice compliment. William asked, once the Lilac left her base station, how long would it be before she returned?
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, she was very strong and durable, but rather slow. Her top speed was 11 knots, which is about 13 miles per hour. One story I've collected from our veterans, which is my favorite thing to do, is talking to our veterans and learning about what it was really like to live and work on board. And he was a bosun's mate, 3rd class, and one of the crew members who could operate the boom for lifting the buoys. And he told me a story about, he was commenting on photos I'd gotten from one of the other veterans. It's like, oh, I remember that tugboat ran into a buoy and it took us hours to get there from where we were to where they were, quite a ways south in the bay. And by the time they got there, the tug and the buoy, which were already locked together, were also covered in ice. And the tug crew was worried that when they got cut apart, the weight of the ice on the tug superstructure would capsize the boat. So they were banging away with anything they could find to knock ice off of the tug. And then Bob, the bosun's mate I was talking to, said he got the cutting torch job and was hung over the side by his feet to cut the buoy away from the tug. And it sounded crazy and hazardous, and it took them a long time to get there. Yeah. Because the boat is not fast.
Greg asks, is the electrical system AC or DC? Good question, Greg.
It's DC. But some of it is AC, mainly newer things that were added. I mentioned the ship hosted a real estate office for a while before we owned the ship, and they converted much of the lighting in the spaces that they were using to AC. But we still have lots of DC on board, and it's in good condition for the most part, so we've let it be. We have a rectifier to convert the electricity we get from the pier to DC to power the DC equipment. So we're running sort of a hybrid system at the moment.
Cool. There was a question from Pete about the banner floating library. What does that refer to?
Oh,
I guess
that was
people
an
don't
art
know.
installation.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
yeah, very popular. I actually had a slide of it that I took out because I was trying to keep this a little bit shorter than I originally had planned. And it was the second installation done by an artist we worked with, Beatrice Glow, and she came up with the concept of making the ship an oasis where people would have to put away their cell phones and just relax on deck with a collection of books. And she put together a whole program of music and conversations to accompany that. And we set a record that year for attendance. So that indicates how popular it was. We had over 10,000 visitors that year. And people kept coming back and asking when the library would return. They really enjoyed it. And she made custom deck furniture for the deck and got donated books. And then the books were redonated to a school afterwards. It all was quite lovely and brought a lot of attention to the ship.
That's great. I noticed you had high school volunteer. Do you partner with any NYC public schools or DOE schools, or do you just put a call out and they come to you, or how does that work?
We have a connection with Stuyvesant High School, which
awesome.
is just a few blocks away from where the ship is now. And one of the counselors there posts jobs for us, and also does some screening with kids. If he feels they're particularly motivated or have a real interest in history, he'll send them over to us. And it's worked out really great.
That's such a neat experience for a high school kid to be able to get out on a boat and have a different relationship with the water in New York than we all do. So I think that's a great program.
Yeah, and they're really smart kids. We typically start them as what I call gangway greeters. Mm-hmm. So the high school students are usually the first people you see when you come on board in the summer, and they give you directions and instructions about moving around safely. And so it just involves a little memorization, really. And then once we get to know them and they get to know us and other things that they could do, a lot of them move on to working on the maintenance and restoration, or being one of the docents who have to know the systems really well and be able to explain them on the bridge or in the engine room.
That's really neat. We Untapped does a series of talks for a group of Stuyvesant High School alum, so they might be interested in hearing your talk. We'll
absolutely.
They love everything Stuyvesant, and I think they'd love this. Rick says, thank you for a very informative presentation. Looking forward to the day that he can visit the Lilac. I have one last question for you. How did you get involved with the Lilac yourself? You mentioned you came on in 2011?
2009.
2009.
Yeah, I can't believe it's been that long. Well, actually, I was married to Jerry Weinstein, who's the founder of the nonprofit that owns the ship, which is how I knew about it. But I have been involved in industrial archaeology for a long time, and particularly in advocating for preservation of industrial sites, which are real underdogs in preservation. And I was kind of beating my head against a brick wall trying to save places that not many people cared about, like the Domino Sugar Refinery in Brooklyn. And then the previous director was terminated, and they were kind of adrift on who they would get to fill the job. And I said I would do it, thinking it would be temporary. And I really got involved because of the steam engines. As far as my interests go, I would not have gotten involved with a sailing ship because I'm interested in the industrial age.
Right.
But I also was attracted to the fact that no one was trying to sink it, as opposed to the other places I cared about, where I always got involved when there's someone busily trying to get it torn down.
That's interesting. It's so interesting that you're interested in the renovation or restoration and protection and preservation of industrial sites. And what do you think of and a little off the topic, what do you think of Domino now?
I haven't quite been able to bring myself to go look at the park, frankly.
Okay.
I have seen it from the water, and I'm very proud that they kept the cranes.
Yes.
They're I believe the last bulk unloading cranes on the harbor, from the days when they unloaded what they called raw sugar, partially processed sugar cane from the holds of ships with a big scoop. And I happen to know a filmmaker who had some footage of the cranes in operation close to when the factory closed, and I sent it to the State Historic Preservation Office and specifically tried to get those to be preserved, and they were, so I'm pretty proud of that.
Well, congrats. They're actually my favorite part of the park, so thank you.
They're turquoise, but
yeah,
it's just paint.
Yeah, they changed the color of all of the industrial accents they left to the colors of the machines inside the refinery. So it's that, I forgot what they called it now. It's what the color of the paint is, but it's a very funny name. Are there any other, thank you, Mary. Are there any other questions for Mary? Mary Neal says, thank you. The presentation has helped with not being able to travel. And again, Mary, like I said, once we can get our people on board, we will also be live streaming the tour as well. So from wherever you are, you will be on board the Lilac once we can be. Any other questions? Mary, I thank you very much for your time and for this great presentation as sort of a bookmark for our time on board the Lilac in person. Anything else any final thoughts you want to say? Mary has the website up for the Lilac Preservation Project. Please check more out. Mary, I give you the last word.
Well, I want to thank you all for attending, and usually the tour starts at the bridge, and you get to the engine room near the end and then end on the buoy deck. So I think you've seen most of it from a distance, and I hope you can come in person soon.
Yes, me too. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. Tomorrow, we are live in Jersey City with Mandy Edgecombe, who will be doing a virtual tour via a gimbal and her phone of the remnants of the New Netherlands in Jersey City. And then Friday at 5 p.m., we're doing our LGBTQ pub crawl with Jillian Courtney. Sorry, I forgot her last name. That's at 5 p.m. A lot of fun, trivia and prizes. And then next week, we start off with a book talk with author Susie Shaw, who is talking about her book about the 1939 World's Fair, We Came Here to Shine. So hopefully see you guys again. Thank you again, Mary. Everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.